In this last hour or so, we are going to talk about some of the sort of emerging trends in wellbeing. I'm going to give you a bit of a point of view, which may be personal, but I think an indication of some of the way that I think wellbeing is going to have to go in the next 10, 20 years. And we've got two case studies from Great Place to Work clients that I think are doing some of the best stuff out there. In fact, next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about generational change and the workforce of the future and some of the challenges I think that are coming our way. Then Guy Hayward, CEO of Goodman Mason, who are currently our best, ranked third, aren't they, in the best medium-sized workplaces in the UK. He's going to talk about their programme called Experience. And then Capital One case studies, Emma Wardrop, who used to be on the HR team of Capital One, is going to talk about that. Some very bottom-up initiatives that were driven within Capital One from the employees. So we're each going to take around about 15 minutes or so to do that. We'll have questions at the end. Now, I want to set the scene with some things that I think are happening at the moment. I want to talk about generational change. I don't know how much that's come up today in the breakout sessions. But I think the workforce is going through some pretty profound changes at the moment. In fact, society is at the moment. And I think some of the differences in generations, I think, have actually been over-exaggerated. But I think the generation that's really going to change things actually is the one that's to come, the kids in school at the moment, who haven't really hit the workforce in a big way. And then I want to talk also about something called the precariat and the automation that's starting to come to many industries. I think we're going through a time of hugely unsettling change for many people. And I think the companies that are going to succeed in terms of well-being are companies that are going to help people, equip them to navigate through the change we're going to go through. So just to start off with, the first point is about generational differences. And I think I would argue, from what Great Place to Work data says, that actually that some of the differences between generations are actually not that great. Not as great as some of the press coverage might make you think. You know, we've probably all seen things like this, the baby boomers, Gen Xers and millennials with, you know, I think sometimes these are slightly lazy categorisations that media people like to use. And you know, some of what's said, I think, about millennials tends to be a little bit sensationalist. This is one from Time a few years ago, lazy, entitled narcissists. But I would argue, actually, perhaps this is nothing new. You go back a generation before, the press are saying some things not too dissimilar about Generation Xers. I'm sure when I was a 20-something myself, I was probably a pain in the arse at times to certain managers, and I think my older self now, talking to my younger self, would probably have some strong words with myself at the time. Yeah, some of those things are just differences between generations. These go back to time immemorial. Even the Romans made points about the feckless youth of Rome. You know, the baby boomers, the hippies, and I suppose the punk rockers of the younger end of the baby boomer group. So some of this has always been there. And our data actually shows, in terms of employee experience and what people want from work, actually doesn't differ that much from generation to generation. Engagement levels tend to be pretty similar. In fact, we found that the baby boomers tend to be a bit more engaged at work, particularly here, the over 65s were the most engaged across the workforce as a whole. But the differences between the three generations aren't that huge. And you know, to some extent, these generations, I think, are quite artificial. You know, trust in the workplace, for example, the levels of trust in the workplace don't vary hugely. The baby boomers are more likely to have trust in the team at 65. The millennials are actually, according to our data, are more trusting of senior leaders, which may go counter to what some of the stuff you read. In terms of what attracts people to employers, it actually tends to be the same things, whatever age group you are. You know, being attracted in by a good reward package actually is the most important driver of attraction. There are things that matter. Location, easy commute, particularly important for baby boomers. Job security comes up pretty high for Gen Xers and millennials. opportunity to progress your career, particularly important for millennials, which I think is consistent with other work that I've seen out there. But actually, it tends to be the same things. Maybe the order priority is slightly different, but again, they're not huge. They're not radically different. Neither does what people stay, and this is other research. I used to work at Towers Watson a few years ago. This is our global workforce study. Again, what keeps people at work? It's that fair reward is the most important thing. Other things that come out as you get older, trust in senior leaders tends to rise up the scale of importance in terms of retaining people. More like to stay somewhere where you trust the leadership team. Length of commute actually really matters for the under 30s in this study in terms of retaining them. Relationship with supervisor or manager tends to come in not so much for the youngest age groups. But again, the differences aren't actually as huge as people might think. I think what is different, though, is the generational expectations are different. I think the younger ones are coming in with very high expectations of sometimes of what a great workplace looks like and what sort of things are out there. Because those things exist. Go back 30 years ago, a lot of the things that people take for granted now weren't around. And these are the kind of things that, this is one piece of research, this is Robert Walters, the recruitment company did 2 or 3 years ago. But you'll find similar kind of things. Work-life integration, people wanting mentors rather than traditional bosses, and the sort of flexible work-life schedule, those kind of things. But actually, I'd say many of the rest of us want these kind of things too in a great workplace. The difference, I think, is the millennials are actually often more willing to speak up because they've had the tools to do so. When I joined my first company, there was no internet. I remember getting a desktop with a DOS prompt button on a black screen, and that was it. And we thought that was pretty cool. But there's nowhere to, if you're unhappy about work, you couldn't go onto Glassdoor, you couldn't go onto social media and talk about it. But what you have found, because they're willing to speak up, tenure has declined. And it's not just millennials, but all age groups. And this is some of the tech firms. The tenure in some of those organisations is incredibly short, less than 2 years. It may be why sometimes their employee satisfaction engagement scores are so high, because actually people leave once the honeymoon period's over. I think the millennials have made it acceptable to move around and job hop in a way that 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you couldn't. I remember a recruiter saying, if you're in a job, you have to stay there at least 2 years to show you've got enough staying power before you think you move on to your next one. These days, that doesn't matter. And people have jumped around, I think, a lot more than these two. Why stick in an unhappy job? They might say, does this mean a lack of grit or resilience in that age group? These are millennials, a lot of them. Very successful companies. To me, that sort of puts the lie to this thing about millennials being lazy. But tenure's declining. But I think the generation that's really going to change things, the one that's next, that's the generation that's in school. And I think the question is, are you ready for some of the things that are coming through from that age group? The British economist Narina Hertz talks about, and she's done some research into what she calls Generation K. And this is Generation K, this is Katniss Everdeen from the Hunger Games, which some of you I'm sure know. And she makes the point that the millennials are really the Harry Potter generation. They grew up with Harry Potter, with that sort of narrative that when things went wrong, the grown-ups would bail you out. This generation grew up with something different. The financial crisis came along, and the adults screwed things up. And she makes the point in her research that what's coming out from these groups is actually we don't trust the adults to get it right. Actually, we need to be self-reliant, and that's what this sort of narrative is about. There's a whole load of fiction aimed at young adults and teenagers like this. I can think of The Maze Runner and Divergent series, that whole genre of cinema and fiction. I think she makes some really good points. She makes 3 things. They shape the financial insecurity. They've seen parents and older siblings lose jobs. So this is a group where financial well-being is key, and I think there's been some sessions on it today. This is a group that, for example, if you're in London, you worry about when am I ever going to afford enough to be able to join, to be able to have a stake in owning property, which I think Guy will talk to as part of his case study. They think that they have a more uncertain future than their parents or older siblings might have done. They've also had this increasing existential threat. You know, we've grown up post 9/11, the whole terrorist thing, in a way that I think wasn't around in quite the same way sort of earlier in the 90s. So they have a lot of concerns there, worries and that. And then technology, of course. They're plugged in, they've grown up with technology. Most of them seem to own a smartphone, and they spend hours a day on it. And if I don't have teenagers yet, my kids are too little. But sometimes getting from my nephews and nieces, getting them out of a smartphone or any screen is pretty difficult. So there are a number of things that are shaping them. And certain things I think we're now seeing. You know, they're very socially networked. They're used to putting their opinions out there, but they're also constantly weighing themselves up, comparing themselves to other people. Digital overload, continual partial attention it's called, trying to multitask. You know, when you've got this in the workspace, when you're trying to work and you're looking at your smartphone at the same time, arguably they're over-examined. There's a lot of talk about stress at exam these days, that constant pressure leading to build up of cortisol and stress hormones. Some people have said they're perhaps less resilient. That helicopter parenting, for example. And also that's people talk to the echo chamber of your Facebook circle, but actually, you know, are they really getting sort of critical, constructive feedback or hearing difficult messages? There's a whole load of things there that I think are coming through in that generation. And there are certain things that I think we're seeing in some of the statistics. On the good side, things like alcohol consumption, drugs, teenage pregnancy rates, a number of those things have been falling the last few years. Other things coming out that are good. I mean, young people are much more willing to talk about, and I think have started, you know, going mainstream on issues like gender dysphoria, which I'd never even heard of a few years ago. You know, I know one teenager who, on there, and I'm phrasing this carefully so you don't know the birth sex, on their 16th birthday came out as being non-gender binary, which, you know, 20 or 30 years ago seemed unimaginable. That now seems quite normal. You have kids even in primary school going through some of these gender issues. They're also a very entrepreneurial generation. The number of teenage directors recorded at Companies House is an all-time high. The last figure I saw was something like 21,000 directors under 18 in this country. But because of some of these other things coming through, you're seeing rising mental health issues from this age group in particular. Not just them, but I think in particular things like self-harming, suicide and so on. Some things that I find, you know, obviously deeply troubling. So there's a whole load of stuff there that I think organisations need to be aware of as this generation starts to hit their workforce. And this ties into something else, what I call what's known as the precariat. The British economist Guy Standing wrote a book in 2011 which actually now starts to look a little bit prophetic. Now, by the precariat, what he means is the workers that are typically the lower economic levels who are subsisting on things like a succession of part-time jobs, you know, short-term contracts, you know, every year or two they're moving, 0 hours contracts and those kind of things that in the Western world we've seen more and more of. And he's saying there's more and more people in that economically precarious zone than there were. And he says what this group does, they live with chronic anxiety, you know, teetering on the edge, knowing that one mistake or piece of bad luck could trip them up. And he says the outcome is this growing mass of people. And he says potentially all of us are outside the elite. And by the elite, he means the billionaires, the plutocrats, and that kind of person, a very small, you know, the 0.1%. And he says that alienated, anxious, and prone to anger. And he talks in his book a lot about political disengagement and the anger that's out there. And he talks a little bit about Sarah Palin, the rise of the Tea Party in the US, the Front National in France and others. Doesn't mention Trump and Brexit, of course. You know, this actually looks, some of what's in there looks quite prophetic at the moment. But I would argue that actually this sense of precariousness is something that we're starting to see, this sort of increased anxiety about quite what the future holds. We don't have the certainties that, you know, my parents had. Does anybody here feel less secure than perhaps their parents were, you know, at a similar stage of life? think back 20 or 30 years. I do. My father was a teacher. He retired having had 40 years in the one job. He said, the one thing I'd advise you to do as a career is don't teach. Good one. Followed that. But he retired. He's still alive just. He's 92, but he's had a 30-year retirement on a defined benefit, final salary pension scheme. He knew that was coming when he was not that far ahead of where I am now. But I think in the stage of life I'm at, I don't think of myself as old as he thought he was when he was the same age as I am now. If you see what I mean. I think a lot of people are feeling that we're less secure possibly than our parents who had those kind of jobs, and we have concerns about our children. My two little boys, I can give them lots of career advice, one of which is probably be flexible and keep learning. But what's the job of the future going to look like? And I think this is a key thing to think about. We're becoming more precarious. The employers that are going to win are those that can help people deal with it. We talk about VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous, that world we're in. Trump, Brexit, all these things that we're dealing with. This technological disruption that's happening to almost every industry and job role in some shape or form. This is unsettling, or can be. If your leaders are not helping communicate this stuff as it goes on, what's the impact on you and your business and your job? There's all sorts of stuff. And we are starting to deal with what the futurist Alvin Toffler called future shocks, that dizzying arrival of the future at an unexpected speed. And this is going to be one of the things I think we're going to have to deal with. We're in a, think back 20 or 30 years when computers came in. You remember programs like Tomorrow's World talk breathlessly about how we get to this age of leisure, because computers would help us to do much more work. Well, it hasn't worked out like that, has it? We're working 24/7, it seems like. We're time poor, we're stressed. We're in nearly full employment in this country. Wage growth hasn't quite gone up in the way that one might expect for a tight labour market, which is some of that precariousness coming in. But if you read everything that's out there about automation, it's clearly going to have an impact. Robots and AIs, say the 2040s, 25 years' time, what's it going to look like? Andy Haldane, the chief economist of the Bank of England, said that in the report in 2015, he said 15 million jobs could be automated by 2035. It's not that far away. The Royal Society of Art said 4 million jobs could be lost to automation in the next 10 years. Slightly more optimistic. Change is certainly coming, and it's going to happen. What we don't know is which job roles and industries. There's some good guesses out there, but at the moment, they're still estimates. But what are the new jobs, the new industries that are going to rise? We don't know what those are. 10 years ago, the smartphone came out, or 11 years ago. And think of what's happened since then with all the app industries exploded out from nowhere. This is what organisations are going to have to help people deal with. Are we all becoming more precarious? I think we possibly are. And I think the high wellbeing organisations of the future are going to be those that help people get through this, helping us deal with the future shock.